Welcome to the Revolution and Ideology series on the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. Today we are picking up with the process called the pipeline. This pipeline was a British process of concentrating Kikuyu freedom fighters to basically douse the Mau Mau Rebellion through violence and torture. And again, I must stress this is the creation of essentially a series of concentration camps by the British. The goal here was to protect public perception, especially back in England. So they argued that they were essentially rounding these individuals up and torturing them and trying to get them to recant their oath because this was part of a, and I quote, rehabilitation process. I must stress that there were 1.6 million Kikuyu in Kenya that at some point in time had to face this rehabilitation process, or at least on the periphery of the rehabilitation process. The goal through the in the prior video we discussed of Operation Anvil, of gathering these individuals up and sending them through the screening process and through this detention process, of course, and the suspension, of course, of any sort of recourse legislatively, was to end the Mau Mau Rebellion. One of the important individuals that was the orchestrator of this was a man named Thomas Asquith. He started to believe that the Mau Mau oath itself was why these Kikuyu had become evil, or to use the word that was being thrown around back in England, terrorists. Aside from Thomas Asquith's belief that the oath itself was evil, they also thought there was a cultural flaw in the Kikuyu. So they brought in what is called, at that time, they no longer exist, but at that time, an ethno-psychiatrist. His name was Carruthers. And he essentially used his fake science to try and analyze why the Kikuyu were culturally flawed in their psychosis. Again, this has already been debunked by all real psychology that exists today, but it kind of shows how backwards the colonial mindset was in the 1950s. Thomas Asquith modeled his pipeline that he was going to create, and again, this is going to be a streamlined system or process of concentrating the rehabilitation process against the Kikuyu. He modeled it on a system from Malaya, another British colony in East Asia, that they used to, again, quote-unquote, rehabilitate communists, and in this case, what they saw as lesser Asian peoples. Again, just to show how wildly racist the British colonial process was, if you have not picked up on that by our prior videos on this topic. The pipeline that Asquith created had 3 color-coded levels, and I don't think there's anything tongue-in-cheek here about it. A white level Kikuyu was only a mild Mau Mau, a non-threat. A gray level Mau Mau or Kikuyu was only a moderate threat, and they would be sent to the labor camps. A black-coded Mau Mau was a hardcore, probably took the 7th layer oath, the Batuni oath, and they would be forced to stay in screening and torture camps essentially until they recanted their oath and were willing to then also oftentimes work for the British to sell out other Mau Mau freedom fighters. Throughout the emergency, various members of the Kikuyu nation would be moved up and down the process. So you could start maybe as white and be moved to gray, or you could be moved from gray to black, or black back down to gray. This process allowed for a little bit of I don't even want to use the word freedom there, but you were able to move back and forth, not again of your own volition, but based on the whims of your colonial oppressor in this case. This is where we see, of course, the birth of Gulags in Kenya. As many as 100 of these concentration camps were created throughout the Kenyan countryside. Many of them, of course, were overcrowded. Many of them served alongside the reserves, where a lot of the Kikuyu women and children were placed. And they were often in the highlands. It created a logistical nightmare, even sometimes, of getting Kikuyu out of like concentrated urban areas into these highlands, so transportation was an issue. Oftentimes that meant there were forced brutal marches that took place, where a lot of people, of course, died on the march outside of urban areas to these reserves. Essentially, the British decided one way to make use of the pipeline that could serve their colonial oppression was through labor. Labor was put into place by what was known as the Swinnerton Plan, and in their minds, labor would help rehabilitate these Mau Mau freedom fighters. Labor included included everything from like fixing the overused soil by British white settlers to helping cultivate cash crops. They also thought it would help free up some space in the camps and allow for non-Kikuyu to make use of essentially prison labor. For lack of a better term, to make use of slave labor. So these Kikuyu were basically put into enslavement, in this case, to profit the colonial power, Britain in this case. All lands, titles, and wealth that a Kikuyu might have had was, of course, stripped and then redistributed either to, again, British settlers or loyalist Kenyans that, of course, were willing to work their other fellow Kenyans to death. This is an important note because all of the wealth acquired by other Kenyans during that time period remains in the same hands, the same family lines to this day. Also of note is that even lesser Mau Maus on the reserves were rarely paid for their labor, and they were still charged hut and poll taxes that were discussed in the very first video in this series. So essentially, they weren't paid very much, but still charged taxes anytime they built a house or, as a poll tax indicates, just for merely existing. These were usually done at some of these softer quote-unquote camps like Fort Hall. Anyway, the Minister of Defense of the colonial process here at this point, a man named Cusack, also was quoted as saying, based on this labor process in the Swinnerton Plan, that we are slave traders, and the employment of our slaves is the Public Works Department. Moderate camps like the Gray Camp would include Embakasi and McKinnon Road and Manyani. It's important to note that those of you who know a little bit about Kenya know that Embakasi eventually became like the airport. So even the airport to this day was built by this slave labor during the Mau Mau rebellion period. To really drive home how disgustingly hypocritical the British were at this point in time is that a lot of these camps would have messages written above the entry gates that were very reminiscent of Nazi sayings, for lack of a better term. So one of the welcome signs outside of Fort Hall, for example, one of these camps, it stated, and I quote, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And the Ngenya camp said, "Labor and freedom." And I quote, "Labor and freedom." Interestingly enough, these accusations are not without precedent. For example, the Soviet Gulag, Solovetsky, and I quote, "You would walk through and see this above your head, through labor, freedom." And of course, the very famous Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz, and I quote, "Work makes you free." See, these similarities, again, are not just like coincidental. It is intentional. And again, as mentioned in the prior video, this irony cannot be lost on the listener, that the British, again, patting themselves on the back for their heroism and their defiance to the Nazi powers during World War II, less than a decade later, themselves were acting as Nazis in Africa, and the world turned a blind eye. Individuals walking under these signs and having to read, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," or "Labor and freedom." They were marched single file, and as they were marched through, they were beaten by askaris. Of course, these were other Kenyans that were willing to work for the British. They were then dipped in a solution. Many actually drowned as they were dipped into this solution to basically cleanse them of all of their diseases. They were given yellow shorts, a blanket, a numbered bracelet, and then rescreened, which was a nice word of saying tortured until they recanted their Mau Mau oaths. Some of the examples of the screening we heard in another video. It included some torture, of course, torture to all parts of the body, but focusing heavily on the genitals, which shows, of course, the gross dehumanization that the British and, of course, the loyalists were willing to impart upon these accused Mau Mau rebels. These camps had poor sanitation, constant labor, and close quarters, which led to numerous disease epidemics. Typhoid wrought havoc throughout most of these camps. This led to inquiries, and all of these inquiries back in England were actually defended by none other than Winston Churchill, who, after a brief hiatus from power after World War II, was back in the driver's seat. And again, this guy that we have somehow turned into a hero in Western civilization for his leadership and defiance to the Nazi powers is himself defending concentration camps less than a decade later. The man is not a hero. Detainees from the camps were often sent out to build more prison camps for their fellow Mau Mau. These are important because as this began to become part of the process, they brought with them many of the diseases from the camp. So basically, if you were new and you got sent to a new camp, you were going to get a disease right off the bat because the diseases were brought by other prisoners who built your camp. And this led to more and more districts having to deal with typhoid epidemics. Some Mau Mau did eventually renounce their oaths because of this process and become screeners themselves. But I must stress that many of the Mau Mau did not. They remained loyal to their movement, and many of the Kikuyu that did not claim Mau Mau or had taken any of the 7-stage oaths remained loyal, of course, to their fellow countrymen. What we'll find out is how resistance worked in the camps, because even though many of these individuals had ended up in these camps, resistance didn't end. Resistance actually took place in the camps as well, and these brave Mau Mau freedom fighters must be celebrated for that. That, however, will be for the very next video.